Hello, friends, and welcome to episode number 63 of Nostalgia Talk. Hope you guys are having a really nice day, and here I am talking like a radio DJ. I'm going to stop that now. Joining me this time around, this is a little message to all of my friends. If you guys think that I know everything that there is to know about the Muppets, that's nothing compared to this guy. Let's give a big welcome to Craig Shemin.
Hello.
Hi, Craig. Good to have you here.
It's good to be here.
Now, for anybody who doesn't know, Craig is a writer, author, and historian. He's written for the Muppets web content and live appearances, the shows The Wubbulous World of Dr. Seuss, telling stories with, I hope I'm saying this right, Tomie I'm having a hard time. Thank you, Tomie DePaola. Courage the Cowardly Dog, Oobi, Gullah Gullah Island, and he is also president of the Jim Henson Legacy. Link in the description if you want to check them out. He's hosted many Muppet events with the Jim Henson Legacy, has also authored several history books on the Muppets, including the recently released Sam and Friends, The History of Jim Henson's First Ever Television Show, which is totally worth the read. And I am going to get to it eventually, but it's amazing, this book, because like Sam and Friends is a show that's kind of faded into obscurity, but it was the first show that Jim Henson did, and look at what a star he's become. Not just because of that, but because of his creativity through that. And in addition to all of this Muppet stuff that Craig is known for, he is also the husband of our friend and past guest Stephanie DeBruzzo, and this podcast is being done with the full support of Stephanie. I never would have done this if she hadn't brought him up. It's, like, I make a note not to bring up the personal lives of my guests. This isn't TMZ, a little thing I like to call being respectful. But I usually just always wait for them to bring it up first. And so Stephanie mentioned Craig, and I said I'll message him when I get done reading the Sam and Friends book, possibly have him come on the show. So I got a hold of Craig, and he was very, very happy to come on the show. His exact words were, "I'll do your show not just because you read my book."
It is true. It's what's great about, it's like I've expected people that I know to read the book, but what's great is I've been getting contacted from a lot of people I don't know, which is really exciting to know that people that I've never met before are reading the book.
Well, you've got somebody who's read it and loves it and thinks that it's amazing, so big thumbs up to you.
Thank you.
So now let's get down to business. You've done so many things in the media. What did you aspire to want to become?
Well, it's interesting. I wanted to be a writer, and I wanted to write not in one specific area. I liked the idea of doing all sorts of different things. And then when I was in college, I ended up getting an internship for the Muppets, and I had been a big Muppet fan, and I'm like, well, maybe I could write for the Muppets. And, I got this job in public relations, and that eventually led to me writing for interviews for the characters. And then that led to writing stories for our publishing department. That led to writing shows and other things, and TV appearances, and corporate films and computer games. So one thing led to another, and it was a great concept for me because I got to do something different every day, basically.
Nice. And you said you wrote interviews with the Muppets. Was that for the Muppet Magazine?
No, I never worked for Muppet Magazine, but whenever there were Muppets interviewed in other magazines, newspapers, that's what I would end up doing. On a couple of occasions, I actually did interviews for Jim Henson because he was busy. So they would send me the questions for Jim, and then I'd write the responses and then send it on to Jim for him to edit and approve.
Okay.
But, Miss Piggy was probably the one who got the most interview requests.
Of course.
So I got to do a lot of interviews for Miss Piggy, and I'd work with Frank on those. So I would sort of draft the initial responses, send it to Frank, and back. This is how long it was. Frank would fax back his notes scribbled on my text. And, that's the sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Did you have a favorite Muppet character to write for during all that time?
During that time, it was Piggy because there was a lot you could do. The hardest was actually Kermit because Kermit works best. He's funny when he's reacting to other characters.
Oh yeah.
but it's hard to make that happen in an interview.
Hmm.
So you get into, one of the things that you'd fall back on was like having Kermit say something. He would be able to make a joke, but then say, well, that sounds like what Fozzie would say, or as my friend Fozzie would say, joke here, you know. But it was a little bit challenging to have Kermit be funny in print because he's just sort of a general every frog character. While Miss Piggy, you could make fun of most any of her traits or use them to create a conflict in the piece. So you could have Miss Piggy. One of the early things that Frank said, that he didn't say it to me, but you know, I was very young, so I'd always want to try and please the reporter, and I answer all of the questions. And what Frank was sort of showing me when he would send back the notes, he would just cross out a question. If he didn't feel that it was a question that could get a funny Miss Piggy response, he's like, "Well, we don't have to answer this." You know, you could use that to shape the comedy. As
Hmm.
I remember, there was one interview we did for a Chicago Tribune, and it was a regular column in their magazine where they would take a celebrity and they'd send them a questionnaire. And it was a very long questionnaire, like 60 questions, but they'd only use about 15 in the article. And so one of the questions was, when nobody's looking, or when nobody's looking, I dot dot dot. And I was sort of taking it seriously, and I was trying to figure out, and I had a couple of different answers and none of them worked. And then I sent it to Frank, and Frank just sent back, when nobody's looking, and then he wrote in, wave my arms and yell, look at me, look at me. And it was like, that's like the perfect Miss Piggy joke, because
It
it's
really
like,
is, yeah.
yeah, it's a setup, it's a punchline, but then there were a whole bunch of other questions in that questionnaire that Frank just crossed out because he didn't think that there would be an opportunity, and I think he knew that they weren't going to have space for all of these answers. When we first sent him, it was like 65 things. He's like, what is this, like a standardized test or something? It's like an aptitude test. It's not an interview. Um,
Right.
so yeah, I think that what Frank showed me there is that, um, you can structure an interview to bring comedy out, and sort of make the most of the questions that lend themselves the most to the comedy.
That's very interesting.
I don't know if that's an answer to your question, but
Oh, that works,
I asked, what were the kind of interviews that you were
yeah,
writing for? So that's a perfect answer. Yeah.
yeah. So Piggy was really the best to do on any of those, that not just printed, but going on the air and television and stuff. There's so much you could do with her.
Mm. And especially if it's like in the case of Frank Oz's characters, such as Miss Piggy and Fozzie, because one of the things I had always heard was that Frank was always good at trying to find more comedy in a lot of these characters,
Yeah.
and not just Piggy and Fozzie, but like especially when it came to working with Jim on Bert and Ernie or Ernie and Cookie Monster. I saw in the documentary Muppet Guys Talking, Frank was saying if we frigged up a line, we just you know kept right on going.
Hmm.
And one thing I noticed is that when they had those puppets on, they interacted as those characters. They did not interact as Jim and Frank. It was like for example, there was I saw an outtake in the Street Gang documentary with Kermit and Grover where Kermit slams the door on Grover's nose and Frank's trying to make it sound like Grover's getting squashed, like I am not trying to sound, but he gets tongue tied and
Hmm.
starts cursing, "Open the damn door!"
Yeah, that's pretty much it. They want to stay in character. But what's really interesting about what you said is that it's not just about the funny, but it's about making sure the characters stay true.
Right.
Because, one of the things, it's like you think about it, and people are like, oh, Fozzie's the bear who tells bad jokes. But he does that for a reason.
Oh yeah.
Every one of these characters have something that they want. That's why they're real. Fozzie wants to be loved. He wants to be the funniest stand-up bear comedian in the world. He doesn't just tell bad jokes. He tells bad jokes for a reason. He tells jokes because it will lead to what he wants, to be the best comedian in the world. Miss Piggy, wants to be the superstar that she is in her mind, and that's sort of everything she does is based on that want.
Right.
And even Gonzo, Gonzo had long talks with Dave Goelz about this. Gonzo's acts aren't just, things, he doesn't just do stupid acts. He does them for the art.
Right.
He has, his quest is to create high art. And for him, that art are these ridiculous acts that he does.
Exactly. Yeah. So you worked with Jim Henson. I had heard you mention in a bunch of live streams that you had worked with Jim Henson a couple of times before he passed away. Because I think when you joined would have been when he was directing movies and occasionally coming in for Muppet projects, but also branching out into fantasy films. What was Jim Henson like?
Well, he was amazing. I was just getting to the point of being somewhat comfortable being in a room with him. He was always very laid back, but I came into it as a fan, so I was always amazed, got very nervous when I was in his presence. And I think he was getting to the point where he recognized me, he knew who I was. And one of the jobs, like I said, I would do quotes. So if there was something that we needed a quote from Jim and he was in the building, they'd send me upstairs. I'd talk to Jim for 5 minutes about the subject that we needed his quote for, and then I'd go off and write something up and send it to him, and he'd okay it. So, and then the first thing that I wrote that got performed by the Muppets was actually a thing that he did as Kermit. It was a video appearance at the Disney shareholders meeting when Disney was going to buy the Muppets, a deal that ended up not happening when Jim died, and then they brought that back like decades later.
That's cool. That
a decade later.
Yeah, because now they've got all the. By any chance, did you see the new Muppet series, Muppets Mayhem? I
did.
What'd you think?
I thought I was really, really pleased by it, and I'm not just saying that because Stephanie was in it. Stephanie did a great job. She was Dr. Teeth's mother. And but I was really, really pleased. I think they did a really nice balance of funny and heartwarming, and it was really done very well. The music was great, and a lot of times I'll be watching stuff that I'm not involved in, and I'll be saying, oh gee, I could have done that better. But this time I didn't say that. This time I said, yeah, I wish I had written this. That's the sort of the highest praise from me. But I was really pleased.
Yeah, I've heard people get all kinds of pissed off over Disney owning the Muppets. But as you had said, Jim wanted to sell them to the Muppets anyway, which is something that people don't really know. So the fact that you wrote the shareholders meeting during what was supposed to be the initial sale, that's really interesting.
Yeah, and it was I still have the tape of it because my job this was Kermit was talking to Michael Eisner live on the stage, and it was sort of interaction. So I was in the studio, and I had to read the Michael Eisner part of the conversation for Jim to react to. So I will listen to the tape. If you turn it up high enough, you can hear my offstage voice, my very young. Hey, Kermit, is like, welcome to the Disney shareholders meeting. And, I'm trying to be Michael Eisner.
So like a rehearsal or something, or?
No, that whenever we do something that's a sort of two-sided thing, we always, someone in the studio will read the other part. Okay. Just so that timing will be right. But we won't read it on a microphone, so it'll be easier to get rid of. They can just take it out.
Yeah, that's how I got one of my first gigs in the industry. I was supposed to in like film and TV and movie stuff. I was reading I've talked about this on the podcast many times. A lot of you listeners, if you're sick and tired of hearing the story, you can skip it if you want. But I was on a show, and they had a character that they just wanted one of the production assistants, which I was doing, to read the lines for. And I said, I'll do it. So I read the lines so that we could time it. And they're like, they were going to have an actor loop it. Before they even could get an actor, I asked, can I be the actor that actually does this character? And that's what they ended up doing.
Well, that's a great thing. Yeah, I did that a lot when we did Jim Henson's Dog City animated show. When we shot that in the puppet segments in New York, and then everything else was animated in Toronto. So one of my jobs, I was sort of a staff writer on that show, and when we did our tapings, I was in the little sound booth doing the voice of the character that would be animated later.
Mm-hmm.
So Kevin Clash, who played Elliot, could react to Ace, the animated character. But I didn't have the good fortune of staying because I wasn't Canadian. I couldn't do, the voice up there.
Right.
But it's probably a good thing.
But at least you had that experience.
Yes, I've had a couple of things. I did an on camera once. We had Miss Piggy honoring one of our licensing people who was getting an award. So she was doing that, and then they had me go on as a production assistant, yelling at her to go get the coffee because she was clearly, not working as a Miss Piggy, the superstar.
So you wrote episodes of the Wubbulous World of Dr. Seuss. What was
I did.
What was that experience like? Because that looks like such a fun show.
It was a lot of fun. It was really technically advanced, and it was at a time where we didn't quite have enough computer processing to do the show we were trying to do. In fact, after a couple of weeks of production, we shut down because there were newer computers available to us. So they're like, okay, we're going to shut down for a few weeks and bring in the new computers. Because what we were trying to do is everything was shot against a blue screen. The puppets were shot against a blue screen, and we had some foreground props. And then all of the Dr. Seuss environments were done as CG. And the CG system was hooked into the camera. So if you could set either the camera to pan across the background, or you could move the background and keep the camera still and have the characters just sort of go up and down, and it would look like the scenery is going by. So there was a lot of flexibility, and you could create these wonderful Dr. Seuss worlds where things didn't quite look like they should be able to stand upright, and foundations were wobbly and buildings could sway. But like I said, the computer could only process a certain number of polygons. And if they added one extra thing, it would shut down and we'd have to restart everything. Ouch. And one of our executive producers, Michael K. Frith, who I worked with for many years, and he had a great eye for detail, but he would always want to add one more thing. And he would, what could one little tree in the background do? And of course, he'd add that tree, and as soon as it's like blue screen, it shut down. So it was a really amazing show. And I think if we had done it, a few years later, the technical side would have been even better. All of these kill me because these were all shot standard definition, and a few years later, they would look amazing in high definition. But it was a show that originally was budgeted and planned to be shot in 3 days per episode.
Oh, wow.
And we never quite got to 3 days. So like the first one was 6 days. And then we eventually got it down to like a 4-day shoot, 4 long days. But this is all in the first season. The second season, they built a physical set. I didn't work on the second season, but they built a physical set for the Cat in the Hat. So they had a little less computer-generated stuff to deal with. So they may have gotten the schedule into a more manageable place.
It would be interesting
to do a show like that now, where they've got because I feel like if they did a show like that now, because it's very creative to have puppets doing Dr. Seuss books, because like puppets on TV, you don't see much of that these days. Sesame Street's still going. Of course, we were just talking about the new Muppet series. Fraggle Rock is back. A lot of these classic stuff is still going on, but we don't see a lot of puppets on TV these days. So yeah, to have that done, Seuss stories in puppet form is really incredible, because now they've got that Green Eggs and Ham animated show on Netflix. I don't know if you've seen that.
A little bit, yeah.
Okay. My sister texted me Green Eggs and Ham is coming to Netflix. I'm like, what the hell? So I have a VHS tape of a Dr. Seuss special that had a couple of stories that were animated. One of them was Green Eggs and Ham. And that's what I thought she was talking about.
No, it's there's something really cool about doing real puppets.
Oh, yeah.
Henson does a bunch of shows for kids where they use the digital performance control system, the Henson digital performance control system, where they have suit performers wearing a suit that has motion capture equipment. They have a Waldo rig so they can control the facial aspects of the character, and they have so they can create an entire character and place it in any setting. Then they can set the virtual cameras in any area. So it's really a cool thing. It's an interesting process. I've never worked with that process, but I think there's something really sweet about just using puppets, because you can actually interact with them, with guest stars and with other people.
Yeah. And plus, you don't have to time it, because it's live.
It's live puppetry, or live animation, as one of my teachers called it once.
Yeah, but that what they've done is an amazing technology. Their system is really cool, but it's there's something really special about having it exist in reality.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things I noticed about some of Jim's earlier work, and even throughout most of his life, is that he was always experimenting with stuff. You were talking about digital puppetry. It kind of reminded me of a skit that I think he produced for Sesame Street with his puppet Limbo, or Face, or whatever he called that. Yeah.
And that dates back into the Salmon Friends era. He started doing that puppet in the very late 50s, early 60s. And it's very simple. It's essentially elastic bands connected to a white elastic band, and it's suspended from above, and all of these the elastic bands have connections with a little piece of string to a glove. So there's nothing high tech about it. But when you shoot that against black and then superimpose it onto something else, it looks a little otherworldly, and it's very cool.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's amazing, the stuff that Jim was able to do, and then that they were able to do after he passed away.
And he actually did the first sort of foray into the digital performance control system was this character Waldo C. Graphic, which was on it was originally done for the Jim Henson Hour, and it was done for Muppet Vision 3D. And that was another character that was a digital puppet that could be controlled in real time. But it was also very expensive to do, because you would have to render it in high res afterwards. So you could only do, I think that when they were doing it on the Jim Henson Hour, I think they could only do up to a minute in an episode, and it was still very expensive. And it was not just that it was expensive, but it took an enormous amount of time to render each frame.
I can imagine, yeah.
Because that's why if you interview some of the people that worked on Toy Story, the first Toy Story movie, it was very time consuming, because each of those frames had to be rendered. It wasn't just the animation. But now things can go a little faster, and they can do stuff in real time.
Absolutely. So you also wrote for a lot of Muppets video and computer games. What was that process like?
Oh, I loved doing some of the earlier CD-ROM games. I did a thing called Muppets Inside. It was the Muppet CD-ROM.
I think I actually had that as a kid.
Yeah. I still have copies of it, but I don't have a computer that can be played on because
Same.
it's a CD-ROM running on Windows 95. And back then, when we
Oh,
were planning it,
jeez.
everybody said Windows 95. It hadn't come out yet when we were working on this game, and we're like, is anybody going to be able to play this? And they're like, oh, don't worry, Windows 95 is coming out on all the new computers. And it was, it was a fun thing to do because a lot of the other people at Henson didn't understand it. So
Whoa.
they didn't understand enough to give notes on it. So I had a lot of control over the material. So I would hand it in to Michael Frith, who was my boss at the time. I mentioned him before.
Mhm.
And he was like, well, just looks interesting, but there's an ending on page 5, and then it goes on for another 120 pages. So he didn't quite understand the whole concept of this branching game. And he's like, I guess it's okay. I mean, so I was able to sort of push the envelope a little bit, and we would be, we came up with just silly things to amuse ourselves. Like we did our copyright notices as little songs that could be found as Easter eggs. And we did, there's a great bit from the Muppet Show where Animal, Swedish Chef, and Beaker sing a version of Danny Boy. So one of our games, we had them sing a bunch of different songs that would be played as little rewards. So I think if you go on YouTube, there are some gameplay videos of that game. So it was a lot of fun, and we got a bunch of press on it and some awards because we were, trying to make the most of what could be done on a CD-ROM at the time.
Very cool. And if any of you guys want to check out gameplays of Muppets Inside, if I can find them, you know where to go. Just click the corner of the video, and there it'll be.
And if you want a copy of the game, if you have Windows 95 and you want a copy of the game, get in touch with James. I may have an extra copy.
Yeah, just leave a comment if you've got a computer that runs on Windows 95. I don't think mine does. So, but technology, these
I
days.
switched over to Mac, so it's harder. For a while, like there were emulators that were doing this, but then CD-ROM drives became more scarce on computers, so that became an issue.
Yeah,
but I loved doing that. True. I loved, that was the cool thing, is that every time you went to the office, sometimes you were doing Muppet meeting films, and sometimes you were doing the tags on merchandise on T-shirts. I got to write several series of trading cards, Muppet trading cards.
Nice.
So a little bit of everything. It was at that time. It was Jim Lewis was when I first started in the public relations department. Jim Lewis and Bill Prady. Bill went on to co-create the Big Bang Theory.
Big Bang Theory, yeah.
And Jim and Bill were the New York staff writers. There was no LA office at that time yet. And then they opened an LA office. Bill went out to work in the LA office. And then Jim was in New York. And then Bill left Henson. He got a deal. I think initially he got a deal at Disney. So they sent Jim out. But before they did, they had Jim and me work together for about 6 months to see if I was, ready to take over the New York slot. So we did that. We worked on a bunch of things together. And then when he moved out to LA, they moved me into his position in New York. And at the time, it was originally associate creative director, and then they renamed it to just staff writer because they figured they wanted to keep the writers outside of the corporate hierarchy. They didn't want us to have specific titles like that. So we were just staff writer.
And you also wrote for the Muppets web series, Muppet Kitchen with Cat Cora.
I did. I did.
Yeah.
That
What
was
was
that.
it? What was that like? Because that like came out when cooking shows on afternoon TV were really really popular. So it was, and I noticed this a lot. The Muppets at the time were bringing themselves into current pop culture, and it was so funny.
Yeah, it was interesting because I had not. I was no longer working for the Henson Company, and the Muppets had been sold to Disney. So I think this may have been one of the first projects I did for Muppets at Disney. And it was Cat Cora was great to work with, and it was a fun show, but a little um, it was a little odd because uh, this was a decision that was made before I came on board, but they decided, well, we're going to have another Muppet chef because no one could understand the Swedish chef. And if we wanted to have, this have some sort of actual cooking take place, I think we were like, well, we'll have the Swedish chef make a guest appearance, but they came up with this new chef named Angelo. So I think, Tyler Bunch did Angelo, was fine, but it was, it's sort of hard to do a Muppet show where you're introducing a new character at the center of it as the host of the show. So
Mhm.
I think um, it was, I had a lot of fun doing it. And one of the fun things is that I insisted that we have in each episode, there's like a little Muppet appearance by one of the classic characters. So we brought back Bear on Patrol, where Fozzie, has vegetables in a lineup that, and we have the Muppet Newsman makes an appearance, and Rolf's in it, and Kermit's in it, and we have Miss Piggy, I think. Um, we so that I put, I really pushed for that just so it could actually have the Muppets that we know in
Right.
the show and not just this new Angelo character.
Mhm.
And I put in stuff that I knew would make me happy, sort of obscure references. There's like an episode that is basically a 6-minute version of the Towering Inferno.
Mhm.
Um, it's a really, it's a campy disaster movie. So I said, well, let's do that. We'll have, you know, they'll try and make a really tall sandwich without acknowledging the safety regulations. And then halfway through the episode, the sandwich is threatening to collapse. And, I sort of cribbed actual dialogue from the Towering Inferno just to, see if anyone was paying attention. And, only a handful of people understood that I was doing the Towering Inferno. But the people that did get it really appreciated it.
Mhm.
And another thing that was great to work on that because Kirk Thatcher directed it. And I had worked with Kirk on a bunch of things. In fact, it was Kirk who helped get me the gig to write the Muppet Treasure Island CD-ROM, which was the next one to come out after um, the Muppets Inside. And it was a situation where they reached out to Kirk first because he had written the movie and he
Mhm.
didn't want to do it. He's like, "Oh, have Craig write it." So I'm like, "Oh, yeah, have Craig write it. That would be great." But on the Muppets Kitchen, we got to work together on that, and he's a great director. And it's a lot of fun. I don't know if you can watch it anymore, if it's out there. I'm hoping that it's somewhere on YouTube or someplace. I
Mhm.
should let Disney know that they should
Definitely
put it
lives in
on.
our memories.
Yeah, but yeah, it was, and Kat Cora was great, because I would put in things where she gets hit with pies and she ended up getting hit with a bunch of things, and she was always a great sport about it. And she had little kids they were little at the time, so they were having a great time watching mom play around with the Muppets.
Mm. Wouldn't be a Muppet show unless somebody gets hit by something.
Exactly, exactly.
Mhm. Did you ever try to do writing for Sesame Street?
Um, Not really. Worked for some. I did some Sesame Street stuff. I did a little development for Sesame, and I did some text for I wrote the text for the roller coaster at Sesame Place, the Vapor Trails roller coaster. They had like a story up on the side of the building, and
Okay.
I wrote that. But no, I never really got into that. They sort of kept things separate, and then yeah, I just never gravitated over towards there.
Okay. So, as I mentioned in the intro, and I'm gonna have a hard
But I
time
will say
pronouncing.
one of the things that I did get to do is that whenever we would do, I get to write for the characters when we would do um, anything that we through the Jim Henson Legacy. We did these concerts at Carnegie Hall, and we did
Yep.
them at New Zealand a few years ago with Brett McKenzie. So I would write for the characters for those things. So I knew the characters, I know them really well. So I was able to, I would write new verses for people in your neighborhood for those things, and I'd write sketches for Ernie and Bert to do. Uh,
Well, that must be a big honor because those are such classics. Anything with Bert and Ernie or the people in your neighborhood.
yeah,
To carry on that legacy.
yeah, it was. The bad thing is that they don't, when we did our Carnegie Hall concert, it wasn't videotaped, because of all of the expenses and the rights and the clearances. So the disappointing thing is to do those things and just have them go away. The people that were in the room, we had two sold out performances. So it was very special to the group of people that were in that room. So I guess there's something special about it not living on in posterity, but no, slightly disappointing too.
Hmm. So, as I mentioned in the intro, and I'm gonna have a hard time pronouncing this again. You co-wrote all episodes of Telling Stories with Tomie
DePaola.
DePaola. What was that like? And did you work very closely with him?
Yeah, it was really amazing because we had just come off of doing the Wubbulous World of Dr. Seuss a couple years earlier. And while we were very proud of what we were doing with Wubbulous World, and I had a script that was nominated for Writers Guild Award out of the 5 nominations for Best Children's Script that year. 3 of them were for Wubbulous World of Dr. Seuss. So we were proud of what we were doing, but we knew that if Dr. Seuss was alive, he probably wouldn't like what we were doing just because he didn't like what anybody did with his characters, unless he was really involved in it. So when we started working on Telling Stories with Tomie DePaola, we were thrilled that we were going to actually be able to work in a room with him. And what we did is Jim Lewis was the head writer on it. I worked on it, and another writer, Katie Rocky. So it was the 3 of us doing all of these episodes. And we started the process by meeting up in Los Angeles. And we spent a couple of days with Tomie. And we brainstormed. I think we did 26 episodes. So we had to do 26 episodes of Strega Nona, because the way that the show was formatted, we had Tomie host the show in this sort of created version of his studio that they built on the Henson stage in Los Angeles. And then there were segments. We did Strega Nona, which is his famous book series about a grandmother witch. And then we did a segment of 26 Fairmount Avenue, which was a chapter book series that he had where it was about him growing up in the 30s and 40s.
Okay.
And what we did with those is that Tomie narrated them, and we had an actor sort of acted out as young Tomie, and he would be composited into photos and sort of, tell the story in these little vignettes. And then we had a bunch of other little segments, but the main one that we had to create new material for was the Strega Nona. So we were able to sit in the room and work with him to create these new episodes. And then he's so much fun. It was, he passed away just a couple of years ago. And there's a stamp of Tomie has a Strega Nona stamp out now. And he was just a wonderful, enthusiastic person, very creative. And he loved to be in this room and generating new stories, because a lot of, he only had, I think he had about 7 or 8 Stregonona books, and we were generating 26 episodes and just sort of coming up with really fun and silly takes. And we were just trying to stay true to it. And the great thing is that he's in the room. So if you're straying off of the path, he was there. He's there to say, well, Big Anthony is not stupid. He just doesn't pay attention. So he's able, just like those little things, get you back on the path. So we spent a couple of days in Los Angeles. Then we went away. We wrote the scripts. Then we sent them through. We sent them to Tommy, and then my other, and they shot the show. They banked everything. And by saying that, what I meant is that they didn't shoot the entirety of one episode at a time. So they started out by doing the Stregonona. And while they were doing the Stregonona, because the 26 Fairmount Avenue segments had a little kid, that little kid could only work like 3 hours a day. So they would shoot Stregonona segments in the morning. Then they'd bring in the kid, and then they shoot, or vice versa. I don't remember if they shot the kid out in the morning. But basically, they would spend a day where it's half Stregonona, half 26 Fairmount Avenue, and they'd do that for a couple of weeks, or three or 4 weeks, until they had all of those segments done. And then they'd move on to another segment where they do, the band. It was, and we had like a little wilderness band that would do a song in every episode. It was the same song with different lyrics, so they could reuse the music. And then the last thing is they built the set for Tommy's studio. And then I came back to Los Angeles for that because they wanted me to sort of cover the set as the on-set writer. So that was, just sort of a lot of fun to sort of hang out with Tommy for a couple of weeks while we shot those segments. And he would take people out for dinner afterwards at night. And one night we went to Chateau Marmont up on Sunset Boulevard. And, it was just a lot of fun. And it was such a great thing to know that you're working with these very well-known children's literature characters, but you have the involvement of the creator. So what you're doing has some sort of, stamp of approval from him.
That's great. It's just great. So in non-Muppet work,
You wrote episodes of one of my very favorite childhood cartoons, Courage the Cowardly Dog. I didn't watch that show much, but I did love it when I did watch it. I think I have a tape of it somewhere. And that is just such a funny show. What was that all like?
Well, it was great. I got into it because one of our executive producers on Wubbulous World, David Stephen Cohen, was the head writer on Courage. So he called me in. And all of these always start as, oh, come in and write an episode, because they don't want to commit to anything more because it might suck. So you do an episode. Yeah. And they don't want to be, it's like, oh, now we have to have them do all these episodes. So you do an episode, and then the big deal is when you get invited back to do the second one and the third one. So I think I ended up doing about 6 of them. And what was cool with Courage is that you would start out, you'd come into a meeting with David, and there were a couple of other sort of writers on staff, and John Dilworth, who was the creator of Courage. And John has an amazing mind. And what you would do is you would come in there with a couple of shows to pitch. And if you're lucky, they'll want to explore one of your ideas. And sometimes they don't, because either they've done something similar, you don't know exactly what's been worked on, and sometimes your ideas are not great. But what will usually happen is that they will have some other ideas that have not been assigned yet. So they'll either develop one of yours and say, hey, we have this other idea we're kicking around. Let's talk about it. And we'd spend that meeting sort of structuring the rough shape of the show. What's the beginning? What's the middle? What's the end? What characters are involved? And that meeting would last a couple hours. And by the end of the meeting, they're like, well, go off, you write an outline and send it in. And you would write an outline. And then, you'd come in, and sometimes they'd bring you in for a meeting to go over it. Sometimes it would, you get notes. And then you go to script. And what would happen is on scripts, because when you're doing puppet stuff, I was used to writing as little as possible. They don't want you to cover that much in screen direction, because the director is going to cover that. But what John Dilworth wanted was as much detail as possible for the storyboard artists, because sort of, if you want something to happen in a script and you don't describe it exactly, storyboard artist is going to take it in a different direction entirely.
Oh yeah, when I'm
Writing, I come across that problem regularly. Like, I have to put in stage directions, and I'm like, okay, they're going to pick up an object, but how are they going to pick it up? Where are they going to put it? Like, that kind of a thing.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes you need to do like, it starts tight on Courage, widens out to include Muriel and Eustace, or pan over. So you want to be as specific as possible. I learned that very early on, like my first outline or my first script. John said, you got to be more descriptive, put in more stuff. And then what John would do is a process that I believe he referred to it as the script being dillied. Because he is Dilworth. So what he would do is prepare the script for the storyboard artists by going through, and he would do little drawings. I have a couple of, he'd fax them back. I think I scanned a couple of them. But he would do little tiny thumbnail drawings in the margin to sort of illustrate the screen direction that I'm talking about, or add new stuff, new shtick that he's coming up with. So this was a very detailed thing. So he would circle things in the script. He'd cross out lines. He would, but most of it was about putting in those little diagrams, those little drawings of Courage, and it's great. And then he would it would finish off. He would put a little drawing on the fax cover sheet of him, drawing on it, and it's like
a drawing of him
Drawing on it. That's hilarious.
yeah. And that's, they would go to the storyboard, and then it's out of my hands. Except I did get to go to some of the voice recordings, so they would call them. I said, "Oh, I'd really love to see the voice recording." And our voice director was a guy named Peter Fernandez, who had done a lot of stuff. He was the voice of Speed Racer in the '60s.
Nice.
And he had done a lot of stuff with Japanese cartoons being translated into English. And then I happened to be in the right place, so they're doing one of my scripts, Journey to the Center of Nowhere, and they're like, "Oh, get in the booth. You can be some of the eggplants in the background." So I think I was eggplant number 2 or eggplant number 3 or something.
That's cool.
Yeah.
So you've also hosted a lot of
Muppet fan events, as well as writing some of them. Like, you were talking about Jim Henson's thing at Musical World, I think it was called, at Carnegie Hall, Retrospectacle in New Zealand, and also Muppet Fest about 20 years ago. And in addition to that, you wrote, I read online that you wrote it, The Muppet Show Live, which of course was like basically a fan redoing of the Muppet Show, which is pretty cool.
Well, what we did, it happened on the same weekend as Muppet Fest.
Right.
And it was done as a charity benefit for Save the Children. And it started out as a very, it was going to be a very small event. It was going to be at the Henson Soundstage, and it was just going to be like Paul Williams and a couple of Muppets singing some songs, and that was it. And then it kept getting bigger. And they're like, "Oh, well, instead of doing it at the Soundstage, let's rent, there's a theater, I think it's called the Avalon now, or It used to be it was the Hollywood Palace,
Okay.
and that is where they did the TV show in the '60s called the Hollywood Palace, and it's this nice, it's not a huge theater, but probably about 1,200 people, and it was
Holy
in,
crap! Wow.
yeah, I mean, uh, and this was on Vine Street near Hollywood Boulevard. So I was like, oh, we'll rent that. But, I think we can get some guest stars and we'll bring in some sets. And it became a bigger deal. So Jim Lewis and I wrote the script and we're like, well, let's do it as a live Muppet show. So we just sort of did it as the format of the Muppet Show, and it just kept getting bigger. And
Like the more you
Martin
write it,
Kept
Baker.
getting bigger.
Well, yeah, they were like, well, let's do, can we have Kermit come out of the Muppet Show sign? We don't have a Muppet Show sign. And Martin Baker, who was a great producer, Lee lives out in England, but he was doing a lot of stuff in America at the time. And Martin was like, well, is there a Muppet Show backdrop that we can, try and do something, or is there one available? And someone, there's not one in the warehouse because the show was shot years ago. And Martin Baker's like, well, let me make a few calls. So he calls this guy Jim, who was the set designer for Muppets Tonight. And the next thing you know, he had somebody paint a Muppet Show backdrop, the logo and everything. Oh, well, we can hang this backdrop. Can we cut out the O? I'm like, well, yeah, let's cut out the O. Oh, we can have Kermit come through the thing. Oh, yeah. And we
just
kept
like
on.
the classic ones.
Yeah, yeah. And so there are little things we kept on adding. And it's like, oh, well, we need, let's do some shtick where Gonzo has to have, can we get a guest star to be one of Gonzo's chickens who didn't show up? Oh, let's get John Voight to put on a chicken suit. And it was always Martin saying, let me make some calls.
Right.
And so it became a bigger thing. And it just, it was a lot of fun to do. And the music director was a guy named Ray Charles, not the blind singer, but there was
Right. Yeah.
he would always introduce himself as I'm Ray Charles. I'm the deaf one, not the blind one, because he lost some of his hearing by working. But he was the guy who worked on the Muppet Show. He was a music guy on the Muppet Show who was the music guy on the Hollywood Palace, and he knew Jim from doing those '60s variety shows. And so Ray came, conducted our orchestra. He, got together a little orchestra, like 6 to 8 guys, and Ray showed up wearing his Muppet Show green satin jacket that, that was the crew jacket one year. It was basically Scooter's jacket.
I was just about to say, yeah, he shows up looking like Scooter.
Yeah. And it was just a lot of fun to do. And it was then we had a break in the middle of it where it was this charity auction where, and then, we had a little moment where the puppeteers talked about Jim, looked back, and then we did, so it was a long night, but it was a lot of fun. We had Brooke Shields come, and her bit was that Miss Piggy couldn't make it, so she was going to play Miss Piggy for the night. So she put on a snout and a blonde wig, and she starts singing, and then we had a video come up with Miss Piggy complaining about Brooke doing the number. And it was interesting because it was the first time, or one of the first times, that Eric Jacobson did Piggy. And we didn't want to put him in the middle of the Muppet fan experience because the puppeteers were going to be visible and seen. And we didn't want to sort of throw him into this. So we shot some stuff with Piggy for both Muppet Fest and for this concert, the show, in New York a couple of weeks before that. So, he did a great job. No one said, hey, that's not Frank. So it was a great vote of confidence for him without having to have him be in the middle of all this. So yeah, I got to do that. And then earlier in the day, I was one of the hosts. Kirk hosted the first day of the Muppet Fest concert, Muppet Fest convention, and then I hosted the second day of the convention. And it's great because you're in a room full of people who all get it. They know the references.
Absolutely, yeah.
Kirk started his day by bringing out his Emmy Award, and I'm thinking, that's pretty cool, but I don't have an Emmy. But I know that, well, in the Muppet Show, there was a Muppet Show episode where they did an award show parody, and they had a bowling
Right.
trophy called the Fred. And it just so happened, the coincidence, I didn't think, I didn't know Kirk was going to bring out his Emmy until that day, And I'm watching it. I know I had to do the next day. And I look outside the back door. This was in Santa Monica, Convention Center, I think it was. And it was right across from a bowling alley. And I'm like, I walked across the street to the bowling alley, and I'm like, do you have any old bowling trophies that I might be able to buy off of you? Oh, we got a ton over here. I'll give you one. So they went into the closet, gave me an old bowling trophy. So I had a prop for my second day. It's like, so I don't have an Emmy, but I have a Fred, And then, then the Muppet fans are like, oh, is that the actual Fred? Is that the actual prop from the Muppet Show? I'm like, no, I just got a bowling trophy from across the street. But you do a gag like that, and you're in that room, and they're going to get the references. So I always love doing that sort of thing and doing events. We do events in Museum of the Moving Image or other places. I know that some people are going to be there that have never seen stuff before. And then I know that there are going to be some hardcore Muppet fans who will really get the little details. So I try and put in a few Easter eggs whenever I do presentations, but I got to keep it accessible to the people who've never experienced it before.
Right.
I've been to the Museum of the Moving Image before. My family made a trip to New York. My sister's actually in New York right now, as a matter of fact, going to see Taylor Swift in New Jersey this weekend.
That's a hot ticket.
I can just imagine the traffic jams that are on every street in New York and New Jersey, like this whole weekend.
Yeah, but with New York and New Jersey, it's always like that.
Fair enough, but especially for something like this.
That is true.
But when I went to the Museum of the Moving Image, there wasn't a Muppet event happening. God, I'd love to go to one of the Muppet events at the museum one of these days. I have, of course, watched your live streams that you did during the quarantine, and those were a lot of fun. I'm just in my room with very crappy Wi-Fi, watching these events alone, and just like so amazed. Like, I'm not talking with them, but I'm in a Zoom room with people like Dave Goles, Frank Oz, Bill Beretta, Fran Brill, who later ended up coming on this podcast. It was so cool. Do you guys have any events coming up?
Well, we're going to do a screening of Great Muppet Caper in June.
Okay.
And then we have a couple of things that are in the planning stages. I think the museum is showing a lot of 70s and 80s movies this summer. So
nice.
I think we're gonna sort of do some of that with the Muppet movies that were made in the 70s and 80s. We are it is going to be the 60th anniversary of the Jimmy Dean Show with Rolf. So I think we're going to do a big celebration of that and a compilation of some of Jimmy Dean and Rolf's great moments. That'll be happening in the fall. And I think we haven't, nothing's been announced, but this is the 40th anniversary of Fraggle Rock. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's a Fraggle Rock event before the year is out.
Oh, nice. At the beginning of the year, I actually did a retrospective on Fraggle Rock in celebration of the 40th anniversary.
And when are you planning on having this drop, as they say, James?
So basically the way that I do this is that I edit it once I get it finished up, like once I get it into once I get it converted, and then I just put it out as soon as it's ready.
Well, if it is out early, if you have listeners or in the Baltimore area, the Henson touring exhibit is I think right now at the Maryland Center for History and Culture, and I'll be going out on June 3rd on the opening festival to do some presentations and introductions, and then that'll be in Baltimore for the next 6 months or so. And there are going to be
Nice.
a whole bunch of other events happening both in Baltimore. There's going to be an online event about Miss Piggy, I think. So if you go to check out the websites for the Maryland Center for History and Culture, you can get all that information. And then there's going to be, if you're a member of the Puppeteers of America, there's going to be a big national festival at the University of Maryland in July. So we'll be doing something there. And then I'll be heading to Atlanta in September to do a Sam and Friends presentation and book signing at the Center for Puppetry Arts. So we got a lot of stuff happening.
Right. Well, all you listeners, you guys know where to go for all that.
Yes,
And
go.
yeah, I'm actually glad you brought up Sam and Friends because to wrap it up, I did want to discuss the book. And like as I was reading it, like I'm reading all of this information about this show that came out, first of all, before my parents were born. Like this was let me just explain what Sam and Friends is for any of the listeners who don't know. As I said earlier, it was Jim Henson's first ever television show, and it was also the debut of Kermit, not yet a frog. He was like an abstract, let's just say amphibian reptile type thing who
Exactly.
looked like that. And the show's kind of faded into obscurity. It was before there was such a thing as VCRs, DVDs, or even digital download for phones. So a lot of the material for Sam and Friends has kind of become very elusive over the last 60 plus years. There are clips of it on YouTube if you do want to check it out, but mostly it's we all know that the Muppets are known for their musicality. It's the Muppets lip syncing to old records. Like I've heard I've Got You Under My Skin. I've heard C'est Si Bon, Singing in the Rain. And they also do some skits along the way as well. It actually was the debut of one of Jim Henson's most popular recurring skits, Visual Thinking, which is one of them. And that one just shows how experimental he was. And as I'm reading it, I was like, it's amazing how Craig got all this information for the show. How did this all happen?
Well, I was really intrigued by this show going back to when I started working as an intern at Henson in the 80s. And I could go to the conference room where they had these big rows of 3/4 inch tapes. And I could take a tape off the wall and I would watch some of these old things. And, I always tucked that in the back of my head. And I was like, boy, it would be really cool to do a book about that. And I started thinking about it. But there wasn't really enough material. There were some scripts, and there's only about 15 episodes that exist, and not even full episodes. Some of them are only partial. And so there's scripts. But then about 7 or 8 years ago, the Henson Archives found this box that had reel-to-reel audio tapes that Jim had made. And he started in 1958, on the same day that Muppets Incorporated was started officially, legally, the Muppet Corporation. This is when he decided it's going to be a real business. So he started recording the audio on the show every day. And eventually it was only the new episodes. He wouldn't record the ones that they had done before. And this was about 45 reel-to-reel tapes. And then I started editing them into individual shows. And it's more than 400 episodes that he kept audio for. So we don't know what was happening visually on them. But for the first time, we had a real sense of what the show was. And keeping this in mind, I approached Karen Falk in the archives and I said, maybe I can do a book. And she was kind enough to pitch Lisa Henson on the idea. And Lisa's first reaction is, there enough material? It was the same, reaction that we had originally. And Karen says, yeah, I think there is. So the Henson family and the Henson Company was very kind. And they said, yeah, you can do this. Here, it basically, they were giving me a gratis license to use materials and images, and then I just spent a lot of time listening to these recordings and reading the scripts and researching. And I just kept on learning more and more stuff that I hadn't learned before. And it took a while, but originally I said, if I can get like a couple hundred pages out of this, it'll be pretty good. And then it kept getting longer and longer because I said, well, now I can do an episode guide, and I can write about the facts behind the songs that they were lip syncing to. If I don't know what's happening visually, maybe I can talk about who Stan Freberg is, and and why this song, what was the history of this song, and who recorded it, and who sang it. And went from 200 pages to 300, 400, and it's almost 600 pages. And I just loved telling this story, because this is a kid who was in high school when it started, and he started coming up with these techniques, these puppetry things, and these characters that are still seen. Kermit is probably the most identifiable puppet character in the world, and he was made when Jim was a kid, essentially right out of high school.
Mm-hmm. Well, it is a
Very
very
amazing book. It is astonishing how you got all of this information about the show, like in the episodes and the guides and stuff like that. Like there's photos in here that I've never even seen before. That's
What's
yeah.
amazing is that they're still finding stuff.
Oh wow.
Just recently, Karen Falk at the Henson Archives had a great discovery in the collection of Del Ankers, who was one of the guys who shot the Wilkins. He photographed all the Wilkins commercials, and his family found stuff. So we're always making new discoveries, and we're always hoping it's going to be, hey, we're gonna, some closet has 50. Let's hope that there's 50 Sam and Friends episodes sitting in a closet somewhere. It hasn't happened, but there's always hope. We've gone to WRC, the TV station, and we're saying, are there any closets we can look around in? And we've looked through everything.
yeah. Well, that shows that
A lot of heart and soul went into this book.
Yeah, and I have to say also, Frank Oz wrote the foreword for it, and he's very generous, and I was expecting to have to talk him into it, and I wrote him an email where I anticipated his response. And I wrote this whole little dialogue between us, and I was like, I imagine it'll go somewhere like this, and then he tricked me, and he wrote back, and he's like, okay, I'll do it. I just thought it would take me months and months to wear him down. But I think that, he was as intrigued by this part of Jim's story, because that's when he met Jim when Jim was doing Sam and Friends. Frank was not yet out of high school himself. So yeah, I have to thank Frank for doing that.
Hi, Frank, if you're listening.
Yes, I'm sure he is. He's out there somewhere.
Absolutely.
Well, that's all I've got here. Is there anything you want to say to wrap up?
I will say that if I thank everyone for getting the book, who've gotten the book, and if you haven't gotten the book, why haven't you gotten the book?
I was just about to say, if you guys haven't gotten the book, there's something wrong with you.
So I will say that you can go to bearmanormedia.com, and you can order it directly from the publisher. It's available on Amazon. It's available as an ebook. It's available as a Kindle edition. And if you go to salmonfriendsbook.com, follow the instructions, because if you have the book or are going to get the book, if you send me proof via email that you have the book, either a picture of yourself with the book or a proof of purchase, a receipt copy, I will send you an autographed book plate and a bookmark and a mini postcard and a little sticker. We call it the Sam and Friends book fan pack, not to be confused with the Sam and Friends book fanny pack, which I haven't had made yet. But yeah, I'm happy to send one of those out in the mail to you.
Well, there we go.
So Craig, thank you very much for talking nostalgia with me today.
Anytime. I'd love to come back.
And to all you listeners out there, Nostalgia Talk is brought to you by SK. No, it isn't.
It should be.
For anybody who doesn't know, that is also a Sam and Friends reference. Watch the show on YouTube. Craig, once again, I've really enjoyed hearing your stories. Getting to basically go head to head with our knowledge of Muppets pretty well. I was telling one of my friends that I was going to be talking to you, and this friend knows that I was watching your live streams, and I was like, "Oh, this guy's amazing and so knowledgeable about the Muppets." And she's like, "Oh, you two should totally go head to head, like have some kind of a."
I thought she was going to say, "Who's he?"
Well, this is giving me a lot of good ideas for Nostalgia Talk live trivia on Facebook. I know I haven't done that in a while, but maybe one of these days. So yeah. So for all upcoming information about Nostalgia Talk, you guys know where to go. Facebook, Twitter. There's a lot of stuff coming up, and I will see you soon. Peace.